Okay, 2 o'clock exactly. Great. So welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Kathy Dion. I'm the Executive Director for the Autism Society of Maine. Every Friday, for the last couple of months, I've been doing a segment. It's been called Coffee with Kathy, but we started adding guests because there was a lot of individuals who are interested in really reaching out and having a broader span to what they were trying to have, from disability rights to learning about other organizations in the state of Maine. So I'd like to introduce today's segment that we're going to be talking about. It's a very unique, segment today, and I think it's very needed, especially where we're 3 or 4 months in, and we know that a lot of individuals struggle around the isolation that we've been going through with COVID. So Lisa Morgan is joining us today, and she's going to introduce herself to everybody, and then we'll get going and having a discussion around that. So if you are joining us by the webinar or joining us live on Facebook, please just remember to go into the chat box and type in some questions. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So Lisa, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Lisa Morgan. I am an author, and I am an autistic adult who advocates for crisis supports for the autism community. I'm a teacher by trade. I have a master's degree in special education, and I was a teacher for years. And in Florida, where we lived when my story kind of starts, I worked at a private school with special needs students. A lot of them were on the spectrum, so it was an awesome job. I miss that. So I have written a couple of books. We're going to talk about this one today, Living Through Suicide Loss with an Autism Spectrum Disorder.
Do you want to tell us how you initially started with writing the book and how that came about, and the story that is surrounding that?
Sure. I look at my story as starting on June 24th, 2015, and that's the night I found out my husband died by suicide. And the reason I start there is because that's just the beginning of my advocacy. It's the beginning of me becoming an author, something I've always wanted to do, but I had never done. But that night was just so wrought with misunderstandings, high anxiety, sensory difficulties that nobody knew I was struggling with. And I wanted to try to make sure that no other autistic person experienced it in that way, and try to kind of give a little bit of information to other first responders and even the victim's advocate, and just to help them know how to communicate with and help an autistic person. So some of the things that I touch on in my book about that night is I found out my husband was gone myself, standing outside by the garage where the police told me to stand, because of my sensory. I get very acute senses, and I knew he was gone when they came out. And they told me, they surrounded me, and I just sunk to the ground. I was just so overwhelmed by having people come into my space and surround me. They thought it was the news. I hadn't even got to the news yet. My brain was just like, all these people are surrounding me. And then I had a hand on my shoulder, which was very heavy and awkward, and just all these different senses. The police car lights were blinking all over the place. There was a lot of people mingling around. It was heat, it was humid, there were mosquitoes. I mean, all these things were coming at me at once, and I hadn't even had a chance to take in why we were there. When it came time to talk to the police sergeant who was there, I couldn't look at him in the eye. I thought he would think I was lying. And I managed to get through that conversation, and just the victim's advocate, she she kept wanting me to talk to her, like interact with her dog, which is fine for people, but I'm a cat person. So I was having trouble with that too. And my adult daughter was there, who helped me a lot through that. She was able to keep, a little bit, but she was a little less anxious than I was. So she helped me. But after that night, I just really wanted to try to help other people not go through that who were autistic.
Do you think, hang on a minute, getting some feedback here. Do you think there would have been something more beneficial for you that night? Because I'm assuming that when people arrive there, obviously it's a medical, and there's going to be people coming in. Do you think it would have been more beneficial if they would have known that you were an adult on the spectrum, or did that not even come up in the conversation? Because at that point we were just talking about what has just happened.
Yeah, that didn't even come up, and I was not able to convey that. I was using all my energy to try to get my anxiety down, to try to regulate myself. I was pacing back and forth, and that's when the victim's advocate kept asking me if I wanted to sit in her car to get away from the mosquitoes. I kept telling her I needed to pace, but she didn't quite understand. She thought it would be better. She was kind and everything, but she just thought it would be better if I sat in the car. My daughter finally said, "Why don't you sit in your car?" And she did, and I was able to pace. The best thing that victim's advocate did for me that night was hand me a whole stack of pamphlets for services that I might need that I could take home, and I could look at them when I was ready to read them, not as anxious, not as overwhelmed. That was the best thing she did for me. Just handed me a stack of papers.
One of the things I hear a lot from other individuals is when they are talking to somebody who has lost a loved one. We hear a lot of people saying lack of emotion, but I think I'd like you to address that, because to me, it's not lack of emotion. It's how you handle your emotions in a different way than what we normally would see. So I don't know if you can.
Yeah, it's really just different. I just have so many emotions that they get bottled up. I've described them before as being on a 16-lane highway and having all the cars come down to one lane and trying to get through that. Like they can't come out. They're just so stuck inside, swirling around. And autistic people sometimes have trouble identifying their emotions. And so what you feel is just completely overwhelmed to the point where you're kind of, well, for myself, just kind of frozen and just completely overwhelmed. And the emotions come later, usually when I'm alone. But yeah, in front of people, I never cried in front of people before. I do now. But yeah, just kind of also being kind of private, with not growing up in the 70s, being autistic. I didn't really make a lot of friends. I didn't fit in. I was different. I learned to do a lot of things alone and become a very private person. So I think that played a part in it too. But yeah, just completely overwhelmed.
One of the when I think about adults, and of course we're talking about the what some people look at as lack of emotion, and I just look at it as, like I said, you see things in a different way. Do you think that working in a special education background prepared you a little bit more, knowing that you've had access to many other individuals that were on the spectrum? So I always find that I learn more the more adults I talk with, the more I learn, and the more that, so I'm wondering if you found that you learned a lot more working with children who.
Well, a little bit, because I was in the teacher role. What I got from them really a lot was validation. And because A lot of things I saw them do and struggle with, I struggled with and did as well. And so there was that validation that I wasn't the only one. I didn't know any adult people on the spectrum at that time. I hadn't met another person at that time. So I had just been diagnosed myself too, at 47 years old. So those kids, I was able to communicate with them. I was able to feel really comfortable with them. It was a really nice situation where, you know, I was helping other autistic kids. It was really nice.
When you how long did it take you to write your book?
I started writing it in January of 2016, and I finished in June. And the way it came about was I was New Year's Eve, and I was facing going into another year, and it just seemed to be a real hard thing for me to do. Go into the year as a new year as a widow, all the different changes I went through, all the different relationships I lost, new relationships that came into my life, all the struggles. I just kind of like had a hard time going into the next, although it was, you know, the clock was ticking, it was going to happen anyway. But that's when I emailed the editor at JKP, Jessica Kingsley Publishing Company, and asked if she'd be interested in a book by me about my experiences. And she said yes, and I started writing it.
Yeah, I keep getting this feedback. I'm not quite sure. Do you get it on your end, Lisa, the feedback?
No.
Huh, all right. Sorry, I'm just getting a feedback, so I'm trying to figure out where it's coming from. So once Jessica Kingsley said, yes, go ahead and write the book. Did you find that difficult to put your words to paper to kind of, relive some of that?
It wasn't difficult to relive it. It was actually very healing. It was a very huge part of my healing in the beginning. And it was difficult to write down what I wanted to say so other people would understand me, yes. And to make the book useful for other people, yes, that was a little bit challenging. Because I wanted to just say the right thing and, make sure I was covering all the things that happened and the different coping skills that I learned. And so, yeah, I think in that way it was, but it was also very, very healing for me to write it.
Have you done some workshops, presentations regarding, your book or anything? Have you been like a speaker for somebody with your book or?
Not with the book. I have with the crisis advocacy that I started. Yeah. But the book was,
talk a little bit about that?
Sorry?
If you wanted to, get into the crisis advocacy piece, I think that's another area that I would love families and individuals to know that there is some help out there and a toolkit that was developed. So if you would like to describe that a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, so after my book was published, I was looking for different avenues to let everybody know it was out there and kind of market it. And what I did was I started asking organizations if they'd be interested in starting a conversation about autism crisis support. There's really nothing out there. When I went for help, I tried to, find help in my own grief and my own struggles through the aftermath of suicide, which is all social communication. You're talking with lawyers and insurance people and creditors and, it's all social, and it was very difficult to do that. So I wanted to try to get just a conversation going. And I did finally with the American Association of Suicidology. Colleen Crichton was the new executive director there, and she was very open to me starting a conversation, and we got a partnership together with Nationwide Children's Hospital, TAPS, and AAS, and we started talking about what we could do. And we had a webinar that was crisis supports for the autism community, which just kind of introduced autism and things that autistic people might struggle with. When they call the crisis text line is where we started. So we did a crisis toolkit where it would help the crisis center workers to not only identify an autistic person they might have on the line or texting, but also to help and to communicate with that person. So we started with that webinar, and then I wrote up the toolkit with help from the people in the committee that we had also started a committee, Autism and Suicide, at the American Association of Suicidology. So that was a first. And we had about 10 people on the committee. And we wrote up the toolkit, and we put a webinar out, which both are on the website, on the AAS website. They can be purchased, I believe, for just a nominal fee. And just kind of start putting it out there. I spoke at 2 conferences. I spoke about autistic people at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And the toolkit's now being used by a lot of crisis centers, at least 200 plus from just AAS alone. The toolkit's also being used by other people who work with autistic people in crisis, so not just crisis center workers. So even other professionals, clinicians, first responders, family, friends, there's a lot of people using that toolkit now.
Okay. The toolkit, can you describe what people, if they went to it, what would they would find inside of it? Is it like different information on like how to tell if somebody, I guess I'm trying to put words to this. How, if somebody needs assistance or help, does it break it down to help them, or is it more or less about how you can help an adult who's on the spectrum trying to understand when there's crises around them, whether
It's mostly for people helping autistic people. Okay. And so it goes on the premise that everybody, it just kind of shows a little bit about autism in general. And so it has some identifying things on it, such as, they might have a lot of misunderstandings. You might be talking to somebody who has sensory issues. They might have trouble identifying their emotions. They may talk about separating on negative thoughts, different things that crisis center workers or whoever's using the toolkit can look for. And then it has a place where it shows how to support them, like asking direct questions, getting straight to the point, using logic words, not emotional words, and what I mean by that is, so the night it happened to me, the way I describe it is, I got a phone call. It was about 6 p.m. I drove up to the home where my husband was living, and I tried to get in using the garage door opener, but I couldn't, so I gave the police the key, and they went in, and they found out that my husband had died by suicide. See, that's all words of logic. That's right to the point. That's exactly what happened. There's no emotion. Emotion is there, but it doesn't come out in my story. So with autistic people, a lot of times they don't speak with emotional words like angry, frustrated, sad, disappointed. So if the crisis center workers could know that, and it helps identify them as well as help speak to them so they can communicate with them better. So there's things like that. Also to help shift the thoughts, maybe try to find a special interest that they might have, to facilitate a safety plan. You might encourage them to write things down, because if they're very highly anxious after the phone call, they may not remember, and they may not have a lot of support. So really try to ask them, pointed questions about the support they might have, and really try to wrap up the phone call or the text with a good solid plan for them to go ahead and get some support. So that's basically just really helping the crisis center workers to help autistic people.
Now, I noticed that you also wrote an article in the Spectrum Women, the online magazine.
Yeah.
Do you write a lot for different magazines, or is this one that you've written in once before, or is that something that you have others that you've done articles for also?
Well, I have a column at Spectrum Woman magazine, and I've also written several feature articles, and I really enjoy writing for them. I've written for another our magazine in Florida about this crisis support for kids. Can't remember the name off the top of my head right now. But I have written mostly for Spectrum Woman magazine.
Yeah, well, I'll have to tag into that because we do our quarterly newsletter, which goes out to, 4,500 people here in the state. It's an online version. So we'll make sure that we talk to you about maybe perhaps writing in our magazine, in our newsletter that we offer.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, my column's called Living Through the Lens of Autism.
Yeah. And, I think, and I'll say it again because I think I've said it before, but the more we hear from adults on the spectrum, the more we understand there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences. And we need to recognize that and not just lump everybody in this one pot thinking, oh, this is it right here, when the pots are all over the place and everybody has such differences, strengths and weaknesses, and they're all over the place. So
and words are so important. That's the biggest thing with me is say what you mean what you say. Words have meaning. I did write an article about that. It's called the meaning of words, I think. And it's just even on a crisis call, when somebody might say, I'm here. And a lot of autistic people say, no, you're not, you're on the phone with me. And then even if you're in the room with them and you say, I'm here, they'd wonder, why are you stating the obvious? They may not get that I'm here means I'm encouraging you. I'm ready to do whatever you need. I want to help you. So words are very, very important, especially in a crisis situation where sometimes there's a lot of regression of skills that autistic adults must have built up. If they're very overwhelmed and their high sensory issues going on and their anxiety is very high, those skills can just regress. And so important of what is said, the words that are used. It's definitely very, very important.
And I think sometimes we talk about using more simple language, not because we think that you're way down on this level, but because the processing of the information and our words have multiple meanings, and we want to make sure we're clear in what we're saying, and you don't have to go into this long drawn out 4-sentence to get the one item you're really looking for. And do you find that helpful?
Yes, and a lot of times another reason is, just in a regular conversation, my mind, I'm thinking about several things at the same time. And if your words kind of trail off and you're not getting to whatever the point is that you're trying to make, my mind goes off too. And I'm also trying to, usually I'm camouflaging, which is something that a lot of autistic people do to fit in. So I have to think about where I'm standing. Am I smiling? Is my face showing an okay smile? What are they saying? What am I thinking? There's just a lot going on in my head at that time. So getting right to the point is so helpful.
If you had to convey, in a couple of sentences to a crisis worker that is coming into a situation to get the information they need, how would you convey what your needs are? Would you be able to, or do you think that it's just too overwhelming at that point and they need this information before they even get on site? Do you know what I mean?
Well, in my book, I suggest, and this isn't my idea, I've gotten this idea from some other people, but to have a card on you that says, I'm an autistic adult, and any other thing that they might need to know about you so that they can start helping you right away. that, if I had that night, I would have given that card out to everybody. But yeah, because it's sometimes very difficult when you're in a crisis situation yourself to find the words. Sometimes I just cannot. I have, in the past, I have not been able to find the words that I want to say as much as I would really want to say them to get help. They won't come. They won't go from my mind to my mouth. And I've read about it being that way for other autistic people too. So what has happened to me is people have said, if I've said I can't find the words, people have thought I meant that I was done talking. And they say, oh, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. When I'm done, like I do need something right now, I just can't say it. And writing it down will help too. If you have access to paper, writing down what you say sometimes comes easier than speaking it.
You know, and that's for me, that's an important piece. I am a parent of a 26-year-old who has autism, and he is nonverbal. So I always have pen and paper in hand, and because he does write also. And I think that people misunderstand adults who can have a verbal conversation with you when they're overwhelmed, that they can communicate in a different way, and it's okay to do that. I do think that we run into that a lot. And it's like, is it easier for you to write down, give them, just put pen and paper in front of them? And sometimes just that cue, that visual cue might be enough for you to pick it up and be able to write down what you need, your needs are, versus verbally conveying that. Do you find that a lot with you, that you, when you're in that predicament of a crisis, especially of the magnitude of what you were facing, that if somebody would have handed you pen and paper, you probably would have conveyed better?
Yes, very much so. And you're right, where people kind of expect autistic people first, if they don't know you're autistic. Sometimes people camouflage so well they don't know you're autistic. But if you have told them you're autistic, they still expect you to kind of behave as a neurotypical person.
Yeah.
And if you're in you might be able to do that if you're not in a crisis, but if you're in a crisis, it's going to be very, very difficult. And sometimes, an autistic person might need to just move out of that environment that they're in, where it's happening. So I was visiting the Salem Witch Museum when I first got up here, and we were going from one place to another inside the museum. Sorry?
Can you repeat that, Lisa? I lost you for a minute, so I didn't hear what you were visiting.
Oh, the Salem Witch Museum in Salem, Mass. And I was with my sister and two of my kids, and we were just going from one exhibit to the next. And there was some stairs, and I reached back to check on my youngest, and I missed a step, and I hurt my ankle. So all the people were still coming down the stairs, and I kind of went over to the side to try to get out of everybody's way. What I needed right then was just for somebody to say to me, what do you need? And I was already trying to figure out how I was going to get to my car, go home, do what I needed to do for my ankle. When around the corner came, a stretcher and two people with the ambulance. And then I was in this ambulance, and there was sirens, and I was with people I didn't know, and I didn't know if my sister knew where I was going and where my kids were. It was just such a shock. And all I needed was a chance to move out of where all the people were and just chill for a couple of minutes and say, okay, let's make this plan to get me to my car. But kind of just took over, and it was a very, it turned into a pretty traumatic experience for me with all the sensory issues that were going on. But nobody just kind of said, what do you need? And I wasn't able to say it either, because that's what I do when I'm in crisis. I lose my words.
Do the people around you know enough that if something happened again, they would be able to offer you pen and paper, because the people that are closest to you understand that, know that? Or would you say they would still try? Because I think we still try to help as much as we can, but sometimes we forget too that, I mean, like I told you, I have a dear friend who is on the spectrum, and sometimes I say something and then I think about it and I go, like, no wonder she was confused. Look what I just said to her. So
I think for me, I would be able to, because I've just read so much about it and I know so much about it and I've practiced it. I might be able to help myself if there was no pen or paper, but that would definitely be helpful. And time is so important. Just giving a person time, your processing speed, no matter how smart you might be, slows down, and you need a lot of time to think. And um, just using those direct words, like you said, make sure you're saying exactly what you mean and meaning what you say. But there are sometimes with people who know I'm autistic, I'll have to say to them, "Yeah, I don't get that. Remember, I'm autistic. I didn't. What are you saying to me? What does that mean?" Um, yeah, they forget. They forget.
Do you feel that you need to let people know, like if you're in a situation and you're in a store and something's happening around you or whatnot, and you're not understanding, do you feel the need to let people know, well, I'm on the spectrum or I have autism, or do you just, that's their issue, they need to, because I do find there's a little controversy between when individuals feel they need to tell people that they have autism, or when families feel they need to say that it's like the individual understanding who they are and being able to tell somebody that you're on the spectrum. um, to me, that always diffuses situations. But I'm always interested in an adult to see what your scenario would be. Would you automatically just say I am on the spectrum?
No, no, I choose very carefully when I disclose I'm on the spectrum. And that's because, see, right after I got diagnosed, I was thinking about, should I tell my employer, my boss, the headmaster at the school? And I was having a little trouble just kind of fitting in again. There was a small staff, and we ended up being like family eventually, but it takes me a little bit, and I at first wasn't fitting in. And so what she told me was she thought she was on the spectrum too, and she thought everybody was somewhere on the spectrum. And so kind of all my help that I had hoped for by disclosing my autism kind of went away, because I should be able to do what everybody else is doing if everybody else is somewhere on the spectrum. So that was a little disappointing. And then another time I disclosed it was with my son's teachers, and all of a sudden everything became my fault because I was autistic. So any communication was my fault. So that kind of backfired on me too. So I have before, and it's been okay, and people have understood. I have before, and people have said they understood, and then kind of expected me to be able to walk into a place where there's lots of people I don't know and mingle and do small talk, and then wonder why I can't, or I go over in the corner, or I leave early, and they don't understand. So I've had a lot of different scenarios, but mostly I'm very, very
Mm.
careful.
And I think that when we're talking about like we're in this mode of the quick action, because when they get on the scene of some sort of crisis that's happening, whether or not it's a crisis with you, a crisis with a coworker, or whatever the crisis scene may be, they seem to be very quick in trying to get their information. And for me, that's where a lot of individuals, they can just shut right down, and there's no information coming out. So is there any guidance that you have on that? Because I know that, your paper and your pen would be helpful, but would you have anything, or is there something in your toolkit that addresses that piece?
Not really. Just in my book, I do mention about the card, having that card to give out. Also, maybe there's somebody with you, if there happens to be somebody with you who knows you and they can speak for you and translate for you. That's helped me a lot when I just have somebody with me. And if I don't have somebody with me, I just literally fumble through the whole thing and try to do the best I can.
Yeah, because they are asking a lot of questions, and this is what I've always found, whether it's the police or the firemen or whatever, it's the rapid response of them asking the questions, because I think they're trying to assess a situation and bring down a situation. But then on the other hand, here you have an individual who that's very difficult for them. I mean, it can take my son, almost a minute just to answer a simple yes or no question. So,
Yeah, because that's not all that's happening at that moment, really. So you have the police or the fireman asking you questions, or the ambulance person asking you questions to try to find out what they need to know to help you. But what's going on for the autistic person is you have somebody that you don't know asking questions. They could have this uniform on that you're not used to. There could be a lot of people around. There could be sirens going off. Plus, you're hurt or whatever it is that your crisis is, and there's just way too much more going on than just the actual talking that an autistic person is dealing with. So one of the biggest things to help them is kind of take a lot of that sensory stuff away if you possibly can. Maybe, even if you know someone's autistic, turn off the alarms, try to get people to back up, give them space, maybe move them to a place that is quiet if you possibly can, like anything to get the senses down, the sensory environment.
can I talk about the week after you lost your husband?
The week after?
The week after.
Uh-huh.
Can you describe where you were at that point in whether it was your feelings or comprehension of what was going on? Were you concerned about the future? Do you remember that time in your life when that happened?
Yes and no. I could look back and say I don't remember the month afterwards, but then I do have certain memories. I do know I had a person with me, very, very dear friend, Carla, who she was with me for probably the first few weeks and whenever she could. And I really I definitely needed that. And that was very, very helpful because I had his relatives come and I had to make so many decisions and so fast. I remember going into the place where he was going to be cremated, and there were two ladies there. And when I walked in, one of the ladies was all emotional, like hello. She's a very, very nice person. Hello, how are you? And just very talkative and up and happy and welcoming. But there was another person on the other desk that was very quiet, and I migrated right to her. And only for the reason of just my own senses being able to cope with what was happening in the moment, I went to somebody who I knew that would probably be better for me, and she was just straight to the point. There were no extra words for her. She got her business done, and that was what I needed. And so walking through all those different decisions that I had to make, and even meals, and who was coming over my house at what time, and his dad, of course, wanted something like a memorial or something for him. So I was gathering pictures together, and it kind of gave me something to do. But at the same time, I was just kind of walking through the next step that I could, and completely, totally, absolutely overwhelmed at every second of every minute during that first week. And I couldn't stop and really kind of think about what has just happened. Just what it meant for me, what it meant for my life. I knew it was bad, but as an autistic person, I just can't stand change. Change is huge for me. If I have an appointment that, changes in the day, I have to stop and take a minute and kind of absorb it. And my life completely, totally, absolutely changed in that one, moment standing outside of the garage knowing that he was gone. It was a shock. It was just, yeah, I don't remember too much of that time.
I have somebody who asked about whether you think it would be helpful to practice certain things for certain crises. Obviously, this crisis was very difficult, something that people don't expect, but we really never expect some of the crisis. Do you find that it's helpful to practice things? Some people talk about scripting, some people talk about actually going to and from, like if it was an ambulance, getting in and out of an ambulance just to get the feel of what that would be like. Do you find that helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Even even talking on the phone to people and getting, transferred to another person, having to tell that person your same story, and then then leaving a message, and then having to call back. I spent so much time on the phone. I would practice all of that, practice talking about what you might need. All of that was new for me. It was I found my learning curve in what I needed to do and the time that I had to do in it just didn't correlate together. I was always trying to catch up and figure out what I had to do next, and figure out what are people saying, what are people meaning. It was a time of hurry up and catch up, and then do it now and do it right kind of thing. When I was dealing with all the aftermath, I would definitely, and I say that in my book too, definitely practice any kind of thing to do with telling somebody what you need really quickly, trying to find out finances, trying to find out, work with creditors, work with insurance companies, work with people expressing sympathy. There was just a lot to do and a lot to work with, and I would definitely practice.
Did you and your husband ever talk about when either one of you would die, any wishes or anything? Because I think that's another topic that people don't want to talk about that. But I think sometimes, especially in a situation where it happens so quickly, if you had some sort of guidance, or was it, no, we never really discussed this. We thought, we still had plenty of time in our lives. And
we never really discussed it. Never really discussed it. And he was in charge of everything. So for 30 years, I had not done the finances. I had not done my own taxes. I had not done my own part. There was so much for me to learn. I would definitely, if I had to do that over again, make sure I knew all of that and not left it all to him. But we kind of, in our marriage, was kind of traditional, where I took care of the kids and he took care of things, and it was kind of split, where we didn't go into each other's kind of areas. And I'm pretty sure he was undiagnosed on the spectrum, and so it just worked for us. And I would definitely do that. It was a lot to learn. And after a while, I didn't have the support that I do now, and I didn't even know how to ask for it, because my husband and I just kind of leaned on him, and it was us two, really. And my kids, but for adult stuff, I didn't go outside of the family. I didn't really ask people for help, and so that was another whole thing I had to figure out: is how do you ask for help? When do you ask for help? How much help do you ask for? How do you say thank you? Literally, so many different situations socially with social communication that got thrown at me that I had no idea about, that I was just kind of fumbling through.
Did you have any indication that your husband was having some issues and difficulties that led up to the loss of life? Did you, as an adult on the spectrum, did you feel anything? Did he make subtle hints? I'm wondering how other individuals that are on the spectrum would recognize or understand that, because I think there are some subtleties there that happen, but I'm wondering if you picked up on any of those thinking back. Or
I didn't have to. I know there are, and I guess for my situation, my husband basically told me if I did this, he was going to kill himself. So it was see a lawyer, and basically
difficult.
I had to, because he was also struggling with some other kind of mental disorder that was undiagnosed, and he was really struggling. And in order to keep me and my boys safe, I had moved out for a little while, and I needed to see a lawyer, and he said if I did, he was going to kill himself. Well, 2 days after he found out I saw a lawyer, he was gone. So for me, it was right there in my face. But the reason why I share that is to tell people who have lost a loved one to suicide, it is not your fault.
Right.
Even though he told me, if you do this, I'm going to kill myself, and I chose to do it, he still chose to, take that step and do that. That was still his choice. And I know a lot of people struggle with, was it something I said? Was it something I did? And in the end, no, it's a choice. And that was, I had to let go of a lot of guilt. I had all that guilt at first, but I had to let it go and understand and kind of accept that that was his choice. And it was none of my business at that point. What I wanted to help him, I offered to help him every time I saw him. It came to a point where it was kind of not okay to go over there and see him, but I think he knew I was there to help. But that was his decision, and that's really what it comes down to when you lose someone to suicide. It's really, I look at it as really nobody's fault, because he made the decision in his mind with the way it was working at that point, what he thought would be the best thing. And it's a very sad situation where somebody's mind is suicidal to the point where they take their lives. If love could stop suicide, I think there wouldn't be any suicide. Everybody, just it's very difficult situation.
Was he getting help?
No.
If he was seeing something.
No.
I think
Again,
that's hard. Do you find that it's necessary for
I didn't hear the question.
Do you find that you need counseling, to work through some of that, or?
Yes, definitely. That's been helpful. But to be honest with you, it's also been a battle in trying to get help because I'm autistic. And the first thing that I have needed to do is to explain my autism. That's definite in a therapeutic situation. The therapist or clinician or whoever you're talking to will need to know that you're autistic. And then explaining autism. If they listen and they're open, then it's fine and you can have a good therapeutic relationship. But if they're not willing to know or accept the differences in how you communicate, it can be hurtful to the person. So right now, I am in a very, very good therapeutic relationship with somebody who understands me, is very open to learning. It's very beneficial. But honestly, be very careful, and when you go to somebody, make sure they'll be open to autistic people and what they struggle with and how they communicate and how she can help you. He or she can help you. Sometimes you have to be your own advocate all the time. And there's not a lot out there. Like, I got PTSD from finding my husband. I ended up with PTSD, and there's really nothing out there for autistic people in PTSD, except there's a book coming out in the fall that I wrote with somebody. I wrote another book.
You can taste of what the book is going to be in the fall, and maybe a title or something, or?
Yeah, it's Living with PTSD on the Autism Spectrum, and it's written from two perspectives: mine as the autistic adult living with PTSD, and a clinician from the professional viewpoint of helping somebody. And where we were very aware when we wrote the book to be cultural competent. So hopefully this book teaches a lot of people who read it about how to work with somebody who's autistic, and for autistic people how to advocate for themselves and get what they need. And it just shows the smash up between the symptoms of PTSD and the symptoms of autism, because sometimes they work against each other for the detriment of the person who has it. So then, like, for instance, the nightmares and the flashbacks are very difficult for an autistic person because an autistic person is usually visual and they perseverate, and so it's hard to get out of that kind of thing. So the symptoms of PTSD and autism kind of, unfortunately, kind of work together against the person who has it. But this is a book that will covers a lot, and I think it will at least start the conversation and be very informative to people who are living with it or know somebody who has it and they're in their lives and they want to help them.
Well, that's nice to know that this is going to be coming out in the fall. So we'll be looking for it so we can make sure that we're going to be posting about that. And, you know, I think that, you know, what you went through is traumatic, but writing about it and sharing it with people is very beneficial, because I think sometimes adults, they don't know where to look. And you are so right with the therapists and clinicians. We do not have enough that know how to work with adults on the spectrum. Here in the agency, you know, we're constantly looking, and if somebody says, oh, well, I go to this person, then we're going to ask them like 9 million questions. Really, do you like this person? Tell me about this, this, and this. So we can get them in our system so we can refer when another adult is calling. We don't have enough in our state. I don't think the United States has enough, where it's just, we forget that our children become adults. And when they're adults, their situations are so different, and we don't have enough people who are there to help them. And it's really difficult. So.
And that's what I'm doing now. I've spent 5 years now advocating, all volunteering, and I've just started a business on doing just that, on working with clinicians to help autistic people and bridge that gap. And kind of like, you know how there's a translator for, you know, maybe someone who's deaf and they translate. That's kind of like what I'm working towards, is just being able to translate and get that communication going between a clinician and an autistic adult in any situation, really.
Yeah, and it is needed in our state. So I thank you for doing that. Looking to see if I have any other questions. So just give me a minute here to, I think we covered almost everything we were going to talk about. Do you want to?
There's one thing that I'd like to touch on, and that is just to say that autistic people have unique warning signs of suicide, and they're different than the general public. And so for autistic people, it's been scientifically proven, we have research behind it, and it is camouflaging or masking is a unique risk factor for suicide. Unmet needs, which can be anything: employment, health care, housing, relationships, any unmet needs. The feeling of not belonging is a unique risk factor for autistic people, and just being diagnosed with autism, having autistic traits, is a risk factor for suicide for autistic people. So they are coming out now with unique risk factors that are not in the general public population, that are, you know, just for autistic people, so people can know that. Even autistic people themselves, they can know that about themselves, and also the people who work with them or are family or friends know that those are things to watch out for.
So what would happen if a family comes across some of these symptoms that they're recognizing in their loved one, that the signs that you were just describing? What should they do? What would be their first step?
I think the first step would be exactly what it would be for the general public, is to ask right out. It's been also proven that asking somebody if they're going to hurt themselves or if they're thinking of killing themselves will not bring them to the point of doing it. So being open and honest: are you going to hurt yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? And just be honest and straight to the point, and try to get them the help they need if they, you know, if they say they are. And even if they say they're not and they're still seeing those symptoms, see if they'll go in and get some help. But again, from the right person, from somebody who understands autism.
Yeah, and there is, whether, you know, we're seeing a lot of commercials because of COVID now. National NAMI has got some things out there. Maine has the NAMI Maine that has help out there for a lot of individuals. And then you have your toolkit that I believe we've posted. We've posted those on our webinar so people know where they are and how to get them. Your book, your next book that will be coming out. As soon as that comes out, we'll make sure that the society also has that, so people will have that available to them. Because we lend out books from our library, so that way people don't, have to buy them. And then if they really want the book, then they go out and they purchase it, usually after they've taken it from our library. So,
Yeah, that's really good.
yeah. So Lisa, this has been so wonderful for you to come on and talk about such a difficult subject. I know that others are going to be, looking at this after, because we've recorded it. And, I want to thank you for being brave enough to come out, for, continuing, with your life and, being an individual on the spectrum, knowing that that was kind of difficult. So I want to thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Anytime that I can share this, I love to be able to. So thanks for inviting me.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We won't be doing Coffee with Kathy for the next 2 months. We're going to take the summer off. I think it's been a little bit hard on everybody Zooming all the time. So, but we will post when we're going to have our next session starting. So thank you, everybody. Are we done with that? Are we done? No? Live.